Peter R. Breggin, MD, is called the conscience of psychiatry for his many decades of successful reform efforts. His scientific and educational work provide the foundation for modern criticism of drugs and ECT, and lead the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. His books include Talking Back to Prozac, Toxic Psychiatry, Medication Madness, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and now, Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety, Understanding and Overcoming Negative Emotions. Welcome to the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour.
Oh, wow. I'm back again, folks, my wonderful, wonderful audience. Once again, such a privilege to every week be able to talk to you, and sometimes by myself for an hour. Today with wonderful Michael Fontaine, a friend, a professor of classics at Cornell, whom some of you have heard in the past, and we'll talk about that in a minute. As always, I want to thank PRN for giving me the opportunity to go on the radio with PRN on a weekly basis. And we have a new arrangement now where I'm actually taping my own interviews around the world on Skype. And then I send it into PRN and I put it up as a TV show. And I do that sometimes Wednesday night at 4 p.m. when the radio show starts. We'll wait an hour or so, and then we'll put it on the next day. So you can hear me live on the radio, 4 p.m. on prn.fm. Go there, and they'll tell you about the app, and they'll tell you about the phone call that you can make to hear it, or tuning into it on the internet. So I've got a wonderful opportunity, and right now I'm at home. I'm looking out, as always, at my big bay window, and there is a tufted titmouse who is sitting on the plastic feeder on the window, and then there are 3 big feeders outside the window, and you may hear that little guy pecking for whatever reason at the plastic. Maybe he's trying to, get a better bite on what he's eating. I'm not sure. So it's very lively out back in the back of my home here in Ithaca, New York. This has been an amazing 4 days for me. 4 or 5 days ago, I decided to take one of the biggest steps in my life professionally. Ginger, about a month or 2 ago, came upon a 2015 article, scientific article, in a highly prestigious British journal, Nature Medicine. And this article had a title that wouldn't let you know it had done anything very interesting, and certainly nothing radical. But on reading the article, we find first that the cover story of the article was they were going to try to test whether or not a bat, does that sound familiar? A horseshoe bat? I mean, hasn't that been where many people thought that the current coronavirus came from? But they thought they'd take these bats and see if they could show that they might be able to have a serious pathogen jump from the bat in nature into human beings. But they did so much more than that. What they did was quite terrifying on several important levels. First, they went ahead and they succeeded in creating a new coronavirus. It's not the same one we have now, but clinically every single characteristic of the one we have now, attacking the young mice, not as badly, not killing the young mice. The young mice become carriers, the old mice, or immunocompromised mice would die from the virus. The virus was resistant to therapy. And as a really big warning, if anybody had paid attention to this rather than burying this article, they would have found out that they had difficulty creating a vaccine for this particular virus, and doing so in mice, and in fact that the vaccines and the treatments could make it worse. So we're talking about a virus that, based on studies that they did of human epithelium in the lungs and on the basis of its effect on mice was really very similar to COVID-19, but not the same. Well, that's bad enough. What are we doing in the United States of America? There was a regulation passed against this a couple of years earlier. Nonetheless, this project went on. Why did it go on? It was approved by Fauci's Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. I mean, why would he have approved this? But that's only the beginning. That's not even the part I've emphasized. The part I have emphasized, incidentally, people just don't want to deal with. They'd rather deal with this issue that I've described to you so far. The worst part of this is we collaborated with 2 Chinese researchers from the Wuhan Institute in creating this extra high power pathological enhanced virus. It's right there in the paper. You just go down to the bottom of the page and you look at what people say about themselves, and the Chinese describe themselves as coming from the Wuhan Institute. And by the way, that section, the Wuhan Institute that deals with this, is headed at the present time by a military officer. And you can bet that in China, anybody working on this is working basically for the military and the Communist Party. They're all one and the same. How could we do that? Well, I was actually afraid to write about this or do a video on this because, for one thing, I thought it would distract from what I feel is, my marching orders in life, which is to be the conscience of psychiatry, as Bert Karen, bless him, called me years and years ago. I thought it would be a distraction. I thought it would bring a lot of attack on me from new areas, and I already had enough. And then about 4 or 5 days ago, there started to be some public discussion about this. There was public discussion about our funding, the U.S. continued funding, which I didn't deal with or didn't know about at the time, of the Wuhan Institute, and how the French had built the Wuhan Institute. And so it just became such an issue of what are we doing with the Chinese government? What are we thinking of? How could that have been possible? How, seemingly against its own regulations, could NIH and Fauci approve this research in collaboration with China? And by the way, the Chinese government, along with NIH and Fauci's group, was putting money into this. So I've been writing about this, and the response has been incredible between the video, which is at the top of my YouTube page, and the blog that I wrote. We've had well over 60,000 downloads and just tons and tons of appreciative responses. So it looks like people are interested in what I'm doing, and of course Ginger is always involved in the background. Wouldn't be making herself public at all if I didn't mention her name all the time. So I wanted to just catch you up on this. This show now. Where does this show fit in? This is interesting. Well, when I thought about this, Ginger and I were talking about Michael Fontaine, our dear friend. He's in the classics department at Cornell. And I thought, he can tell us about plagues of the past. He can tell us about what were the first plagues recorded like. What could we learn from them? And so we're not going to get into politics at all. That's not what Michael does. We're going to talk about what we can learn from classical history. And at the beginning, I would like Michael to tell us just serendipitously about his new book, because he didn't call me about the book and I didn't call him about the book. And it sounds like it's really gonna be an interesting book. I haven't seen it yet. I just talked to Michael yesterday, but I think it's going to be a really interesting book. And I'd like him to just talk about that, and then we're going to go on to talk about the plagues. And if we get time, we'll return to a subject he and I touched upon on my radio show 6 years ago, be about the very first critical analysis of psychiatry, which actually goes back to its very roots in 400 BC and manifests in a play. So, Michael, hi. I'm glad to see you. I think my guests can tell I'm glad to see you.
Hi, Peter. I'm excited to be back with you. It's always good to see you.
Isn't it fun to be doing our own videos and stuff and running my own TV station right from my house?
It all feels so professional, but one of the most surreal experiences of all this isolation is doing these Zoom calls and seeing the insides of people's basements and seeing what's happening in the background. And it brings a real humanizing factor to just about everything we're doing these days.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this. I'm seeing all my patients on FaceTime, and a number of them Cornell students. And I was so delighted that every single person I've been working with face to face when I closed the office as I had to stayed with me on FaceTime. And then a few people from the past got in touch with me. And so my practice is, if anything, just a little larger than before shut down.
I'm not surprised that talk therapy is proving more popular right now than probably at any time in the recent past. We have seen a lot of distress all around town, as you might imagine. And so it's good that you're there for the people that are seeking you out, and you're increasing capacity, it sounds like, for other people that could use some friendly ear, some advice. So that's really good of you to stay with them.
Yeah, and I've done a couple of TV shows I want to mention to people, radio TV shows, the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour, that deal with how do you relate to each other in these tense conditions when we're together with our children full time and our spouses or our partners. And I think it's an opportunity for people to grow hugely by changing and improving under stress, meeting the challenge, and really really learning better ways to relate to each other. And right now, it's interesting. People are much more interested in what I have to say about the coronavirus than about living together in a more idealistic and wonderful way. I think it's a mistake, folks. It's a real opportunity to get together. So, Michael Fontaine, would you take us back to the first epidemic that is recorded in history?
I'd be happy to. So this, as you know, is my expertise. I'll just remind the audience, I don't know anything about virology or epidemiology, so I would not be the person to talk about that. But I do know a lot about the beginnings of literature. And if you were to ask someone, what is the oldest piece of literature in Europe? The answer is Homer's Iliad. If you remember Homer's Iliad, the epic story of the Trojan War, the Greeks invade Troy. They fight a war that goes on for 10 years trying to get back Helen of Troy. If you go to page 1 of Homer's Iliad, we're going back about 2,750 years ago. It begins with a plague. So the soldiers...
I forgot that.
That's right. It's right there on page 1 and page 2. And they don't know what to do. The soldiers are dying. The Greek soldiers are trapped at this war, and they're dying. And so plague, so the guy, they interpret it as the god Apollo is angry at something that one of them has done.
These are the Greeks, not the Trojans?
That's right. The Greeks in the camp, so the invading army outside the walls.
The invading army, not the one trapped inside. Okay.
That's right.
They're shut down.
That's it. They're outside of the camp, and they.
No. I mean, the Trojans are shut down. They're inside the walls.
That's right. They're being besieged. That's right. Yeah. There's connections with all of this. It'll feel familiar.
Okay.
But what happens? So the plague element of that part of the story goes away fairly quickly. It's there at the very beginning. It's written in the literary theorists call this sort of thing the MacGuffin. What you say, what is a MacGuffin? They say, well, by the time you ask what it is, the story's already started, so forget about it. And so the plague gets the story going. But what happens is later authors in Greece, almost all of them, who looked back to Homer as sort of their version of the Bible, they remarked on that plague, and it becomes a metaphor in a lot of their literature. And so you see in the fictitious literature, the plague comes back as a sign that something is wrong. Maybe you've offended God, or you've failed your community. But even the historical writers, and this is the one I want to talk to your audience about, the historical writers saw plague through the lens of the Iliad. And so the most famous plague of antiquity, and maybe of all of history, happened in the famous city of Athens in the year 430, 429 BCE. So if you do your math, that takes us back 2,550 years. And what happened? Well, Athens, this is the famous city that the tourists are always going to, right, with the Parthenon and the museums and everything. That city was in a big war with its neighbor Sparta. And this is a war that was dragging on for longer than most wars. And in the second year of the war, some kind of plague struck the city of Athens. So this time it is the people who are holed up inside. They're being besieged by the enemy, but the enemy simply walks away because the plague is so terrible. And during that war, there was a general named Thucydides who had he had a command and he basically screwed up. And so he was dismissed from his command and sent into exile, meaning he was free at that point to pursue whatever interest he wanted because his career was over. So he said he would write a history of this great war, and he would talk to people on both sides. And he said, I don't really owe any special allegiance to my own side because, of course, they got rid of me, but I'm not partisan either. And so he writes the history of the Peloponnesian War, everything that goes on for a number of years. But in the second year of the war, he pauses the narrative to talk about the plague that struck Athens. And he says, we don't really know what it was, but I know that in the future, it'll come back. And I want to record my experience, what the symptoms were, what the signs were, but most of all, how people reacted when this plague struck. And so he gives us a moralizing treatment of plague. So illness as a metaphor. Have you ever heard that in your practice? Illness as a metaphor? Is that a commonplace? I'm not sure.
No, I don't think it's a commonplace, but it certainly would be in maybe more literate and literary people than psychologists.
Yes. But it is
illness
interesting.
Is a metaphor.
Well, it's both, right?
Freud would have gone along with that way back, because he thought that physical illnesses, turned out to be psychological in origin. He wasn't talking about real physical illnesses. And he thought that they were metaphors in a way. They represented traumas. They represented feelings and yearnings and so on.
So I agree with you. The Freud, that is his interpretation of that. But in this context, I'm thinking of contagious illness as a metaphor. So not only that the person got sick, but that the person is somehow a vector of disease. You don't want to be around an ill person because you think that they maybe somehow deserve to be sick, or that if they had washed their hands better, they wouldn't be sick. And so these are attitudes that tend to come out every time.
Would they have thought about that way back then?
Washing hands is tough.
Hands?
Well, they did have hygiene. The Greeks were famous, and even more the Romans, but for baths. And so they did take care of themselves. They, of course, had no microscopes, but they were very familiar with contagiousness.
Yeah. Okay. So they had two ideas about contagiousness. One was the moral, and they also had a physical idea.
That's right. And so the physical.
If I interrupt too much, tell me
no,
stop.
No, not at all.
You want to go ahead with your narrative. I really love interacting with you. Go ahead.
No, it's a pleasure to talk about these things because they were quite clear, and I can read some of this to you. I have it up here on the computer.
Yes.
That they were clear. This is a real disease and it's contagious. But how do people react? And so let me just read you a little bit. It's a short piece. I won't read the whole thing, but. He begins, he says, in the first days of this one summer, what happened? In Attica, which is the region where Athens is, the plague first began to show itself among the people of Athens. It was said that it had broken out in many places previously elsewhere, but a pestilence of such extent and mortality was nowhere remembered. So this is a big one. It's going to be distressing to read some of this. And this is interesting. I wonder what you think of this. He says, the doctors at first were of no service, ignorant as they were of the proper way to treat it. But instead, the doctors themselves died the most thickly, the most commonly, since they were the ones to visit the sick most often. And no other human intervention succeeded any better. So prayers in the temples, divinations, and so forth were found equally pointless until the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to all of that stuff too. Right? So right at the beginning, you see almost the same things we're seeing today. The doctors don't really know what this thing is. They're valiantly trying to treat it. It's not clear what's going to work. We're seeing the news change daily, even hourly, about new interventions. I'm seeing in the news there was something about now they want to put people face down, and now there's something in the news about getting this oxygen test and so on. But the doctors themselves, I don't know if you've seen this in Italy, quite a number of doctors, I mean, it's tragic beyond belief, have sacrificed their lives in service of the ill. And the very next thing he says, Thucydides, very next thing he says, he goes back to the beginning. He says, at first it began in the parts of sub-Saharan Africa, below Egypt. And it came up from there into Egypt and then into North Africa, Libya. And that's how it made its way into Greece. So just like today, people they want to know right off the bat, where's this thing coming from? How did it get out? Why are we dealing with it? And you can see the impulse to pin blame somehow. Cause, blame, we can call it either one. But there's this impulse to want to try and, at this point, it's almost irrelevant, isn't it? Like how it got here. Now we have to cope with it. And the last thing, and then maybe I'll get your comments here. He says, when at first it fell upon Athens, more or less it exploded on Athens. And it first attacked the population in Piraeus. Now, Piraeus is the port of Athens. So it came into Athens the same way it comes through our airports. It came in through their shipping ports and that sort of thing. And he says, this is the beginning of all kinds of problems. So what do you think? Do you see similarities with what we're seeing now, or am I pushing my case a little too far?
Oh, no, not at all. I have so many questions. I mean, one of the immediate ones is, what was the symptom complex? What were they saying? These sounds like Thucydides, whom I did read at one point in my life, a little bit of. These people knew how to describe things. And my other question is closely related is, can we guess now what it was?
I can answer both of those questions for you. Let me read you the symptoms, and then I'll tell you what the latest thinking is on all this. So he goes right into that. He says, it's quite interesting. He says there's a drop in other illnesses at the same time that this thing is hitting, which is something we're seeing in the hospitals too. But he says, as a rule, there was no ostensible cause. People in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heat in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes. The inner parts, the throat, the tongue became bloody, and it started to emit an unnatural and fetid breath. These symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness, after which the pain soon reached the chest and produced a hard cough. When it fixed in the stomach, it upset it, and discharges of bile of every kind, named by the physicians, ensued, accompanied by very great distress. In most cases, also an ineffective retching followed, producing violent spasms, which in some cases ceased soon after, but in others much later. On the outside, the body was not very hot to the touch, nor pale in its appearance, but it was reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. But internally it burned so that the patient could not bear to have on him clothing or linen, even of the very lightest description, or indeed to be otherwise than stark naked. What people wanted best was to throw themselves into cold water. And indeed, some people actually did do that by the neglected sick. They plunged into their rain tanks in the agonies of unquenchable thirst, though it didn't make any difference whether they drank little or much. And he goes on with a few more things. He goes on to say that there was this miserable feeling of not being able to rest or to sleep, so the sleeplessness. The body, however, did not waste away so long as the distemper was at its height, but it held on to a marvel against its ravages. So people, I think he's saying asymptomatic on the outside. You're not seeing the wasting. So that when they did succumb, as in most cases, on the 7th or 8th day to the internal inflammation, they still had some strength in them. But if they passed this stage and the disease descended further into the bowels, it induced a violent ulceration and severe diarrhea, and that brought on a fatal weakness. And so the symptoms, this would probably bring back memories of your own medical training. I mean, the body seems to have all kinds of problems that can go, all kinds of things can go wrong with it.
It's very, very different than COVID-19. It's a very different affliction.
Yeah, I mean, this is, so what is he describing? Everybody wants to know. You asked me this earlier. What is it? Well, it turns out you're not the first person to ask. For a couple hundred years, you usually get somebody who knows Greek. That would be somebody like me, and somebody like you, a medical doctor. researcher teaming up and saying, let's figure out what this thing was. Well, in 1994, the city of Athens was extending its subway line. And so they were excavating underground. And lo and behold, when they were digging this one part, they came upon a mass grave. And inside the mass grave, there were a whole bunch of skeletons left from this very time period. They could radiocarbon date them. And they pulled DNA out of the teeth. And the latest thinking that that analysis identified the disease as typhoid fever. There had been some 30, 40 different kinds of guesses, but every time the doctors would say, well, a lot of the symptoms do look correct, but they don't match up to anything exactly in our manuals. But that is the latest thinking, typhoid fever. And all these people died of this thing. So Thucydides goes on at great length about some of these different the symptoms and things. But then he transitions his narrative, and it's fairly short, but he transitions to say, how did people react to the plague? What do you do if this happens? And he says, this is quite affecting right here. He says, some people died in neglect, others in the midst of every attention. I think today you might
of what?
Every attention.
Oh, in every attention. Okay.
And today they didn't have hospitals in ancient Greece, but they did have, doctors made house calls back then. But it's sort of, we're reading about people in the paper dying at home, others dying in intensive care units. And they're dying in both cases. And but here is the break in his narrative. He says, by far the most terrible feature in the malady was the dejection, the depression that ensued when anyone felt himself or herself sickening. For the despair into which they instantly fell took away their power of resistance, and it left them a much easier prey to the disorder. Besides which, there was after the awful spectacle of men and women dying like sheep, though having caught the infection in nursing each other, and that's what caused their greatest mortality.
Wow.
Isn't it? I mean, it's quite moving, isn't it?
It's very moving, and the sophistication. I mean, they're saying that the depression that went with it worsened their mortality. Did I hear that properly?
This is what he says. He says that is the most
sophisticated observation. I mean,
that's it. People become desperate, not desperate. They become hopeless. They give up hope.
Yeah.
And the terror, right? You start coughing. I hesitate to even raise the question, but I imagine you must be hearing from people who are catching illnesses and getting pretty scared at the moment.
Of course. Sure. One of the things it reminds me of when we're hearing from all these so-called experts is that wisdom has always been with us, and experts don't necessarily have it at all. And
well, one thing, Thucydides
had wisdom. He had wisdom.
Thucydides was a very, very intelligent person, and he says at the beginning of his history, he says, why am I writing this history? He says, because I think human nature is the same in all time periods all around the world. And I think that the same problems will come back. And he has a famous line where he says, I'm not writing this book as the sort of like today you would say as a TED Talk. It's not meant for an immediate audience. He says, I'm going to write a possession for all time. I want a reference book that people will come back and they say, well, material conditions change, social conditions change, but the human being is basically the same. And so the illness coming back, isn't this a stark reminder in 2020 that we are not post-biological people, right? I mean, so many people have this illusion.
I've never heard that phrase. I love that. We're not post-biological people.
No, we
are rooted in ourselves, our biology, our mammals. We're mammals.
This is it. We're wet blobs walking around.
Glorious beings and spirits who can attain to God, but we're mammals.
This is it. And, there's always this idea that we can have a technological fix for something, chemical fix, a pill that will, and it's true that medicine can do all kinds of amazing things, but there are things it can't do. And boy, is this a reminder. So let me just read you a bit more of this.
Sure.
So what happens next? This is quite interesting. He says, what happens? A lot of people living out in the countryside came running into the city to try and get away. So new arrivals came into the city. Now, of course, with the hindsight of history, we know that's a terrible idea. But they got there. there were no houses to receive them. These people coming in from the country had to be lodged in stifling cabins. Now, when I read this, it brings to mind these emergency hospitals we're building in football fields and auditoriums and convention centers, right? The boat that we're bringing. And so what happens? He goes on to say, as the disaster passed all bounds, men and women, not knowing what was to become of them, they became utterly careless of everything, both sacred or profane. And this is where he starts getting into the moral dimensions. What happens when you think that life is hopeless, that you can't beat this thing? He says all the burial rites that were previously in use were disturbed. People started burying the bodies as best they could. So burial, as you know, of course, in many societies, a very important ritual. We're seeing the distress it's causing people right now, that we can't bury our family members as we would like to do, the way we've always done. So people started stealing other people's pyres. It's awful stuff. He says this is not the only form of lawless extravagance which owed its origin to the plague. People started committing crimes, which we haven't seen yet, maybe because it's not as severe here, but I would imagine it's not because of that. But he said people were saying, well, we're going to die soon. What's the difference? I might as well enjoy what little time I have left. So people resolved, he says, to spend quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and riches as alike things of a day. Perseverance in what people called honor was popular with no one. I don't know if you would agree with this, but again, when I read this, it reminds me of the resistance we're seeing right now. People are feeling so cooped up. They're saying, well, I'm just going to get this thing and get past it, and then hopefully I'll be immune and move on. And we have the medical experts saying, well, that's not a good idea. We don't know this virus, but we are seeing this sort of fatalistic idea. I don't know if you want to react to that. Well, you may disagree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Americans have just been sterling. I mean, throughout this period of time, I think that, sure, we had our kids down at the beaches doing what they were doing, being stupid down in Miami and so on. But what's new about that? I mean, in general, what we're seeing is heroism. We're not seeing doctors refusing to go to work at all. We are seeing doctors get really scared, scarier than most of us, because they're really exposing themselves. We're seeing policemen doing their work. I think that we're seeing just the opposite here in the United States. And frankly, I think it's partly because of the leadership. I won't get any further into politics than that, but other than say, I think our president is really providing a good balance between hope and realism, and just setting an example every day, doing these multiple hours, talking to people, answering questions, bringing in the scientists. So I think that he is so engaged. I think it helps other people engage. I haven't said that before, thought that before, really. I think the protests that we're getting now are good American protests, where people are saying enough. We also need to begin to recreate our lives and our economies. And these are people who are protesting are not arrogant, wealthy people. They're probably mostly people who own small businesses or lost their jobs, and the process have not been violent. So I just think America in general have done really, really well, Americans. And I'm glad to see it. There's been a little bit of looting, very, very little. Very little.
Let me echo your point on the medical professionals, the nurses, the doctors, everyone. You're quite right. It is truly heroic. It must be pretty scary to do these jobs, and they go in, they do it, and that extends quite, as you say, to these other services, right? The mail is being delivered, packages are being delivered, the buses are still being driven. You're right. So that's an excellent point. Let me agree with you on that.
Yeah, I love this country, and I think that's one of the things I represent among intellectuals that maybe not enough other people do. And I just love this country, and I think that we may be getting more back to our roots now. That's one of the things I'm hoping for. But I am not going to involve you in that conversation. as much as we have enjoyed our private conversations about these things. So much to talk about. Now, what about does Thucydides make an observations on differences of responses in the genders? Does he talk about the slaves and what happens to them? Does he talk about poor people and what kind of slaves did they have then? I think they had slaves, didn't they?
Oh,
and what kind of poor people? Does he talk about poverty and so on at all?
So those are all great questions, and unfortunately, the answer is no to almost everything you said. Thucydides only mentions women. I once read all of Thucydides in Greek a couple of times, and I think he might only mention a single woman in the entire book. Women fall outside his realm of interest as agents in history. And if he mentions slaves, he doesn't do it in any humanizing feature whatsoever. You're very good to bring that up. Athens in this period was an empire. It ruled, I mean, it was a dinky empire, but it was an empire, and it ruled over, I mean, it was small. Yeah. And in fact, Thucydides, he interviews many of the subjects of the empire. Again, just before this passage, there's a famous speech where the leader who succumbed to the plague, a guy named Pericles, he says, we have an empire that's like a tyranny. He says, we didn't want this empire, but it's way too dangerous to give it up now. And so Thucydides does problematize the idea of being colonized throughout the history. And if people are interested in that, you can read the speeches where the different actors all get an opportunity to respond and complain about their treatment. But Thucydides was an aristocrat. His family owned metal mines up around near Ukraine on the Black Sea. And so he was in exile, but he had the wealth and the leisure to travel around. So all of that, most people are left entirely in the background. He's interested in power politics at the highest level. But here, so he does humanize, as we were saying, sort of the everyday responses to the plague. He doesn't really put a status.
Very much humanizes that. What about children? Are they in the same boat as women and the slaves?
Say that one.
Children.
Say that again.
Children.
In this passage, no. And I'm trying to think beyond that. I don't think he says much at all. No, he's really interested in.
The children get the disease. Do we even know if he's observing?
I don't think he singles out any status between men and women. He does talk about people throughout the passage, and we would assume children for sure. As I said at the beginning, I think the estimate is 25 to 30% of the population died. Yeah. Thucydides himself got the illness, and he actually trumpets that. He said there was this flush of emotion for people who got the disease and got over it. They felt like they were going to live forever, and they were the ones who were most eager to help the ones who were still suffering. It's very interesting because we're now talking about antibody tests all the time now, and of course they didn't know anything about antibodies, but again they could see on the macro level that people who got over it weren't getting sick a second time. But this idea of surviving this horrible, deadly experience and wanting to help others is pretty amazing here. He gets into one passage, though, toward the end, some of the different reactions. And this is one of the saddest things. He says people were giving up belief in the gods. You know, they had a polytheistic society here. They said, well, the gods are not really helping us in any way. So people just stopped observing religious rituals and they stopped praying. And they said, where is God in all of this? And I think we tend to see the same impulse every time there's a natural disaster. People ask this, or any kind of disaster, where is God, or where are the gods in this role? People started turning to horoscopes and this kind of thing. I don't know if you're seeing this in your practice, but people do it. He ends his account by, he says, people, they quoted a line of poetry that old men said had happened a long time ago, and that this war from Sparta will come with it, and when it does, it'll bring death or dearth. We're not sure if it was death or dearth. And he says it's a bunch of baloney, but people are going to change the verse to fit whatever they want. But people start to, maybe not so much horoscopes, but we are seeing, and it's really unfortunate, people turning to sort of these quack cures that, people are now on the internet. You see the cranks selling all kinds of, cure COVID illness. I don't know if you're seeing this kind of stuff, but it's out there. And people are desperate looking for these kind of things.
There's two lines of thought I wanted to pursue, and we've got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes left. I think it would be really good to just stay on this theme of your huge knowledge about these things. But one of the things I wanted to say is I think it is so important to understand what humanity has been through and may yet go through again, and to have a perspective on what we're going through now. And sometimes people have noticed that I seem to be less anxious about what's going on than other people are, that I'm somehow, it doesn't frighten me in that kind of eerie and unreal way that it does many people. And I mean, who knows? Who can explain one's own emotions? I think we more make up things than we actually have insights often, and certainly in my case. But a part of it is that I have read history. I lived through polio, which was far more terrifying to me when I was 12 years old than what's going on now. And my closest friend with whom I'd been wrestling a few days earlier died overnight of polio. So, I mean, I confronted in a really horrific way early this kind of thing. And I lived through World War II. Ginger said I should mention, that I used to walk along the beach during the World War as a little boy. I was born in 1936, so I'm about 9 years old, during 8, 9 years old, and younger maybe, and I remember seeing, never forget it, a broken piece of a life raft, and attached to it is this tall bamboo with a red flag on top, and I'm imagining the probably American sailors, almost certainly American sailors, torpedoed by the submarines off of Long Island, and thinking about what they were going through, and then the Holocaust, learning about the Holocaust when I was 10, seeing it in movie tone news. So I think I've not been in denial about the world and what it can do, although I've been very interested in always trying to make it a better place. It seems to be genetic practically for me. So I think there's a certain peace and calm that I have that I want to share with other people, knowing that humanity has been through so much, that we still live comparatively in the best of times historically, even in the midst of this. Our longevity is going to be greater than people have had over thousands of years, and we get a chance to communicate with these, to talk to each other like Michael and I are, or like I do with my grandchildren on FaceTime. So I bring a certain perspective, and if you believe in God, God's time, God's time is beyond our imagination. Things happen over hundreds of years, and so I just want to share a little bit of where some of my peace in dealing with all this, which I do deal with directly. It does not cause me to run from it, I don't think, comes from. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it. Did the Greeks ever write about it? Have ancient philosophers written about the human condition and, appreciating what you have at the time or anything like that?
That is exactly why I am on, this is why I do what I do. The classics are all about studying the human condition, how to prepare for disasters, how to keep them in the proper proportion, how to be grateful when times are good, and appreciate, even at the height of your happiest moment, to realize that a day will come when it won't be as happy. So get ready for it now and keep everything in moderation. Everything in moderation. So you're right. One of the, this is quite interesting. One of the happiest things I saw recently is that Dr. Anthony Fauci was a classics major as an undergraduate. and what that tells me is here is a person who at least has been exposed to the human condition through the ages and understands how to think about what, the big picture, as you say, to look at history. You're quite right. These are personal experiences you're relating, and you're right to put them all in the right context for us. Polio was a scourge that I have no sense of in my own life, but it's within living memory, this awful, tragic disease. The Holocaust within living memory, not mine, of course, but so many of us today. All these terrible things that, as bad as this is, you're right. Look at the good things we have right now. So we're isolated at home, but here we are with high definition cameras talking in real time.
Yeah.
I've been able to Skype with my family. You're doing the same. We can all do these things and sort of appreciate what we have. And that's one of the fundamental insights of the Greeks and the Roman philosophers after them. They said, what is it like to be a human being? It's clear we have these base impulses that we have to satisfy. Everybody gets hungry. Everybody becomes afraid. But what is the best way to prepare yourself for problems that arise, either because of that or getting along with other people? You may be aware that recently Stoicism has become a very hot philosophy.
No,
So
I didn't know that,
Stoicism-
but I was just thinking about Stoicism
That's
and
what this is.
thinking particularly about the Roman slave whom I read so much of all of his work. Maybe what's his name? Who was
Epictetus.
Epictetus, who taught the emperor, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Well, maybe say a few words about Epictetus and.
He wrote a handbook. Well, so Stoicism is hugely popular in California. I'm understanding Silicon Valley, they love this stuff. Stoicism is an ancient philosophy. It started about 2,300 years ago. And the idea was that the universe is, in a way, fated, and that bad things will happen, and you can't really change them. So there are things you're just going to have to accept. So if you say, even today, the word stoic, what is it? People say, well, it brings to mind, suck it up, don't complain, but also don't let this stuff rattle you so bad that you freak out when bad things happen. And in the ancient world, and up until fairly recent times, these philosophies were studied in the way, or they were followed the way that religions are followed today. Mm-hmm. So in Greece, there were maybe 4 or 5 major philosophies. And in a way, they're a lot like denominations of Christianity or denominations of Judaism, where the basic principles will be similar, but the actual practical strategies for coping with problems will differ based on whether you think, for example, water dissolves into atoms or whether water flows together. This is a sort of a famous dispute. Mm-hmm. But they can build out these practical strategies. What governs all of that is that, death is inevitable. It's part of being a human being, and it can be really frightening, or we'll see it, but how can we cope with it and practice for it in misfortune? So a lot of these books written a couple thousand years ago are still incredibly practical today. Epictetus was the Roman slave. He wrote what's called the Enchiridion, the handbook. And this handbook is just sort of one-liners, little maxims, aphorisms. Yeah. You kind of memorize these things. You write them on a yellow Post-it note and you stick it to the fridge or to the bathroom mirror. And they're little precepts to hold on to and rehearse. Yeah. Kind of like worry beads. You keep them in your hand. And even in the scariest circumstances, you try and remember this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about it that his philosophy in particular was that I think that they suppressed the passion of love in order to not get too attached to the things of this world. And that's where I've gone way away from.
I'm with you. Someone once called Stoicism a cold creed. And I have to say, I agree. I mean, it's a very cheerless way of, it's not for me. There are other ways of doing it. And I know that at least a couple of years ago, you were writing and thinking quite a bit about love and acceptance.
Oh, more and more.
Is that right? Yeah.
More and more, while I also do more and more of the dismal scientific work about what's going on in the world, psychiatry, and now with the plague and so on. We've got about, I don't know, we've been talking for almost 50 minutes and go about 10 more. I don't want to leave the issue of women out of this, because I was a bit stunned, and I'm not unsophisticated. I've been interested in women's studies from the earliest times, and during the heyday of when feminism really broke across the country. I was friends with a number of people, and I've got a section in my book, Toxic Psychiatry, about women in psychiatry and so on. But it's stunning that this observer of humanity, Thucydides, gave no acknowledgement to women, as if they didn't exist. And it sounds like children either. Is this typical of the ancients? Is there anybody in ancient times who was actually thinking about the situation of women? I mean, after all, the Great War was fought over a woman. Did any of the writers care about Helen of Troy and what she was going through? I mean, it's a little off topic, but I don't want to just pass by an issue like that. So maybe you could take a few minutes and tell us about specific question. Yeah. Did any of the writers, were any of them women, and did any of them care about women and children other than Plato's and some of those folks interested in young boys, which was I would look upon as enslaving of children, sexual enslavement of children. And is that fair enough? I'm going off in this stuff.
Well, I mean, so the Greek institution of pederasty, yes, we're talking young boys. Yeah. That would be illegal. It's immoral today. I don't know anyone who's in favor, but it's historical. It happened.
Yeah.
So let me get back to your question. The answer is, for Thucydides, yes, he's only interested. You're quite right to raise it. It's an important issue. It's a very important issue. Thucydides is only interested in political decision-making at the top level. Now, in almost all of Greece, that meant only men. Why? Because Athens in particular, but much of Greece, was gender segregated. Women were more or less confined to the house. They were not allowed outdoors without a male chaperone. And even within the house, men had a separate room where they would congregate with each other. Women were kept upstairs, excluded. And so it was not in any sense an equitable society. Mm-hmm. And so that trickles down into a lot of the writers. There's one great exception, and it's the playwright Euripides. So there were three great tragedians. Euripides is the last of them, sort of a Shakespeare type of his time. And he was intensely interested in women and precisely the fact that women never had a voice in public. They never had much of a voice in literature. There are some.
You did a radio show with me.
We talked a little bit about this.
Yeah. What year? My gosh! If people could go,
folks, a couple of years.
If you go to my archive, radio archive, and look up Michael Fontaine, you can do it. And it happens so quickly, you'll think it hasn't happened. So the minute you look it up, you get the name of the person. And one of his shows delved deeply into a play about women empowerment and also about love between women. And I think it would be really good to come back to these issues. I want to have you on at my next opening, which is, if you would honor me with that, which is maybe 5 or 6 weeks. I'm not sure how far I'm booked up. And I want to talk about women some more, and we'll do that right now too. And I want to talk more also about the earliest classical play, which really took on psychiatry. Yeah. Psychiatry is just beginning. I mean, and the playwrights are ridiculing the drugs already. So we'll do that in your next visit.
You will see that these playwrights, they were political actors. They said, we're going to debate the major issues of our time, and we're going to fictionalize the whole thing and set it 1,000 years in the past so we can make some changes in society today. Very politically engaged. Yeah.
So a little bit more. So talk a bit more then about Euripides. And
So Euripides wrote a number of tragedies, specifically with women, front-loaded the major character. The starring role is a woman. Probably the most famous one that the audience might know is Helen. Pardon me, not Helen, Medea. Medea was the woman. She's an immigrant woman who was brought to a new community by a guy named Jason. She's brought from the Black Sea region where she's from to Corinth in Greece. She's a foreigner, an immigrant, and her husband promptly runs off and takes up with another woman. He abandons her with the children. He's not in any way a good character.
Times do not change.
This is it. Euripides was kind of onto something, and people read this and they say it's amazing. And so Medea is abandoned, powerless, no rights, no citizenship rights, no way of getting back home. kids to take care of. And so what happens in the play, the famous act of the tragedy, is that she gives a very long speech talking about her unfair treatment, how evil this is. But to get back at her husband, she murders the children.
Oh, God. I forgot that. I repressed that.
Yeah. So unfortunately, and so Euripides in antiquity was called, well, maybe not so much in antiquity, he was called today he's called the first feminist and the first misogynist. And you have to decide whether is it sympathetic or is it not sympathetic. So the Medea is the most famous one, but he wrote a couple of tragedies about Helen of Troy. She was the one in the Trojan War and who had gone off to Troy with a young prince named Paris. And the Greeks always debated, did she go willingly or was she abducted and taken away? And so the fiction writers would spin it both ways, where she sort of ran away from her husband or she was taken away. But in these tragedies, Euripides tried to give women in particular an opportunity to speak. There's a couple more. There's one called the Ion, which is another tragedy about a boy who's not certain who his father is. And so it's an opportunity for a young man to sort of explore the idea of uncertainty where the father is not present and so on. So Euripides, more than anybody else, was interested in these questions.
It is amazing how men just at times shine through all this darkness and just see the situation of women. Among psychologists, Alfred Adler was stunning in that way. He's really a social psychologist, and he wrote a book about the empowerment of women. I mean, early part of the century, last century. It was just amazing. Some people see it, and no matter what the time is, what the time period is. Michael Fontaine, my goodness, what a pleasure to be talking with you. It's like having lunch with you.
I'm enjoying it very much.
It may be
it's always
better
good to see
because
you.
we work harder to talk about interesting things. Any parting thoughts? Anything that occurs to you? I just think it's a pleasure to have you on board, and I want people to go back and listen to some of your earlier radio shows. And sometime in folks, late April or May, I want to have you back on. I'll get back to you about the open dates, and we'll talk about more of these issues.
I'd be
I hope,
happy
folks,
to.
it gives you perspective on being a human being. It's good to be a human being, but it's so complicated, and it isn't easy. You know, one of the things, a parting thought is, with all the advantages I have in life, and my ability to think and so on and so forth, and the good fortune I've had, the good health, I find life hard. Everyone has to find life hard. Don't forget that. And to me, what saves life is our ability to have friendships and to love one another. I really believe this is what saves life. Love for children, grandchildren, love for husbands, wives, partners, friends, love of learning, love of nature. It's that, let yourself take a joyful dive into life, even in the middle of this virus. That's my parting thought, Michael. Take a dive into life, even more so than ever, in the middle of this virus, but do it safely. Michael, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Peter.